morning, everyone. Good to see those of you that are here. You probably know that in the last week or so, the music department has kind of been going in terms of COVID cases and quarantining and everything else related to that. So I'm glad to see we have more than half the class here today. That might not be the case in the near future. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. As you know, last class I returned your tests. We went and looked at that. We looked at your, half of the week, we looked at your first transcription project. And I do have all of those now. It might be a while before I get those back to you graded. In fact, I'm thinking it might be not until after spring break when I get a chance to really do that. But just to let you know, I do have those. So, and did I give you the second unit assignment? I believe I did. Okay. So all you had for today was a reading out of your book, and it has to do with the beginning of the wind instruments. Starting around page 76, chapter 5 on the woodwinds. And my goal I'd like to take 3 classes, including today's class, the next class, and then the class after that, to cover what we need to know about the woodwinds. My goal today is to get through the piccolo, the flute, the oboe, and the English horn. Then the next class, I'd like to go through the clarinets, bass clarinet, bassoon, contrabassoon, things like that, and then start talking about scoring for wind instruments. And then the third class, 2 classes from now, I'd like to finish up talking about scoring for wind instruments, so that we can, let's see, how many classes do we have? Yeah. The goal is to try to get through the woodwind section of the orchestra by spring break. That's the goal. And then after spring break, we can start discussing the brass. Okay? So, I've got nothing to return to you today, so I think I'm just going to go right into start talking about these woodwind instruments up here. And I hope to show you some examples. I hope to give you some examples, and I hope to let you hear some examples, some fine examples that I think of with regard to some of these instruments. Okay? So by the way, how many here actually play a woodwind instrument? A lot of you do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So saxophone, clarinet, saxophone, and flute. And what is your woodwind instrument? Saxophone as well. Well, I actually talk about the saxophones after the second test, so got to wait a little longer for the saxophones. They're a special. Well, you guys are in a special class by yourself, right? Anyways, how many of you have taken class in woodwinds? Any class in woodwinds for that matter? Okay. How many of you are in a class in woodwinds right now? Wonderful. For those that are taking class in woodwinds right now, what are the instruments that are being discussed? Oboe and bassoon. Oboe and bassoon, okay. So the other class of woodwinds, you did clarinet and flute and saxophone. Gotcha. Okay. Well, I don't want to repeat anything you guys know, but hopefully you guys will glean or learn something that you have not heard, or I'll just come at it from a different perspective, and so you'll learn something new about these woodwinds that you don't know already. So, with respect to the ranges of the various woodwind instruments, I want you all to be responsible to know the bottom limits. That is the lowest note possible that the instrument can physically produce. I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing the upper limit, especially when it comes to piccolo, flute, things like that. The sky's the limit for some of those instruments. But I do want you to know and be responsible and have in your head the bottom limits of each. That is the lowest note possible that the instrument can physically produce. And I have, on the board over here, I have the written low limits for the piccolo, flute, oboe, and English horn. The written low limits. So over here we need to know that piccolo, I don't want you writing anything for the piccolo lower than D4. The D right next to middle C. can't write anything lower than that because anything written lower than that, the piccolo will not really be able to produce. Any pitches lower than that. And by the way, while I'm on this, these are the written low ranges for these instruments. The piccolo is a transposing instrument, but it transposes an octave. It actually sounds an octave higher than written. So the opposite of the contrabass, which sounds an octave lower than written. The piccolo sounds an octave higher than written. So, technically, the piccolo can really not sound any pitch that's lower than the D right here. Physically, right? D5. So if the written range for the bottom range of the piccolo is here, the piccolo is really not going to be sounding anything lower than this D right here. And if you check in your textbook in chapter 5, I think the upper limit physically for the piccolo is like the highest note on the piano. But anyways, don't write anything lower than this D for the piccolo. The flute. Where's my flute player? This one flute player. Okay. Don't write anything below middle C. Is that correct? Right? Flute players can eke out a middle C perhaps, although it's going to be probably weak and breathy. Yeah. But don't write anything lower than it. And by the way, the flute does not transpose. So what you see is what you get. That's really nice. The oboe, please don't write anything lower than this B flat. I guess it's technically B flat 3. The B flat below the middle C. Because the oboe will not be able to produce any sound lower than this pitch. And the oboe is non-transposing as well. So that's kind of nice. What you see is what you get in terms of pitch, actual sound, written notation, all that stuff. And finally, the English horn. Please do not write anything lower than B natural. That is B natural 3, or the B right below middle C, because it doesn't read or produce anything lower than that. However, the English horn is a transposing instrument. It sounds a perfect fifth lower than written. So if the lowest written note for the English horn is a B, what's the actual lowest note that an English horn can produce? Not a G, an E, a perfect fifth lower than a B, right? So the lowest note that an English horn should be able to produce, if this is its lowest written, that means this is its lowest note that it can produce. And I'm not to the clarinets yet, but it's very similar. Clarinets, I think, goes through it, just a tiny bit lower than that.
No, she just wouldn't be.
Yeah, but that's your written pitch, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
So your sounding pitch is actually a little bit lower. And it depends on if you're doing clarinet B flat or clarinet in A. Clarinets in A can actually go a little bit lower. But that's for another class. Okay, the piccolo. Can't learn everything. We're not an expert on piccolo. We can't cover everything about it, but we can learn some things. We talked about how it sounds an octave higher than written. This means that when we're reading a transposed score for piccolo, we have to go up an octave to find the actual sound or the concert pitch for piccolo. Conversely, if we're trying to convert actual sound to written notation, we must write the pitches an octave lower than we want them to sound. Maybe I could do just a few quick examples for the piccolo right here. Let's say I'm in this key of, it doesn't matter, B flat major, and this is the written pitch for the piccolo. That E flat right there. What is the actual sound coming out of the piccolo? Yeah, an octave higher. So this one right here. Okay. And let's go the reverse direction. If the actual sound that the piccolo is producing is this one right here, what pitch would I have to write for the piccolo for it to give me that concert pitch or actual sound? Yeah, I'd have to write the B an octave lower than that, okay? So I would write this one. So you write this for the piccolo, and you hear this. You write this for the piccolo, and you hear that, so on and so forth. Does any of you, I would imagine, I mean, I don't have a pet dog. Does anyone have a pet dog right now? I would imagine dogs don't care for piccolos too much. What do you think? I mean, especially if, what happens if you're actually writing the notes up here? Yikes. So you realize the piccolo can be, if it wants to be, the piccolo can be ultra piercing. The piccolo, believe it or not, is, according to the author, the most agile instrument of the entire orchestra. It's able to perform incredibly fast runs, skips, arpeggios, elaborate figurations of all kinds, you name it. So it's the most agile instrument of the entire orchestra. What do you think the piccolo's most valuable purpose is to an orchestra? Well, it's to add a brilliant edge to a particular line, right? Because the piccolo is so high and its tone is piercing, it can cut through. Its main purpose is to add some kind of an edge or brilliancy to whatever line it's playing. I like that term, brilliant edge. That's what I use when it comes to piccolos. The piccolo is frequently used to double other woodwind instruments and even string instruments an octave higher. That makes sense. The fingering for the piccolo, does the fingering for the piccolo differ from the fingering for the flute? No, it does not. The fingering for the piccolo is the same as that for the flute. And generally, in an orchestra, the second, or if there's a third flute player in an orchestra, usually the second or third flute player will double on the piccolo. Double on the piccolo. Do they talk about piccolo in class and units? They do. Okay, good. And I don't know because I wasn't there last night, I'm ashamed to say, but are there any piccolos in the wind ensemble? How many?
I think the soloists play them.
Two piccolo players, maybe?
We have some.
They alternate, they go back. You can always tell when they're playing those, probably, can't you? And that's not because they play wrong notes, it's just because their tone is super high, it sticks out. All right, music written for the piccolo, as with all other woodwind instruments, requires plenty of rest. Those of you that told me you're woodwind players, do you appreciate rests in your music? You can live with them, you can live without them. Take them as they come, leave them as they go. It doesn't matter either way. Well, I don't know, in my reading about woodwind instruments, especially in your text, it really stresses, brass as well, but woodwinds and brass need a fair amount of rest in their music. A fair amount of rest in their music. Because it requires a lot of breath, a great deal of breath to play a piccolo, and for that matter, a flute. Okay? Moving on quickly to the flute. And you can ask questions if you want about any of these instruments that we just talked about. I'll see if I can answer them. But second only in agility to the piccolo is the flute. Thankfully, the flute's pitches, sounding pitches, and written notes are the same. It is a composing instrument. Like the piccolo, the flute is weak and breathy in its lowest octave, brighter and stronger in the next higher octave, and it can be described as brilliant and even powerful in the third octave, and you could even say it's piercing above that. So one example I typically like to show you is on page 101 in your text. Hopefully you can see, I'm just really interested in the top two stabs here of this chart. This chart is about woodwind instrument registers. And let's take a look at the flute first of all. See the bottom octave for the flute? which terminates down here on middle C. That first octave is considered to be weak and breathy. In fact, if you want to hear the flute in that octave, you probably better not have too many other instruments playing at the same time. Or you want to have a light scoring with other instruments if you want the flute to come through at that octave level. Then the next octave is called brighter, stronger for the flute. The next octave, brilliant and powerful. And the fourth and final octave above that is, again, your dog will not appreciate it probably. Are there any differences between the descriptions of the notated octaves for the piccolo and the flute? It doesn't look to me like there are, right? The lowest octave for the piccolo is weak and breathy, and brighter, stronger, brilliant, powerful, and fine and piercing. And remember, the piccolo will sound an octave higher than those notated pitches. So keep that in mind when we eventually start scoring for woodwinds, that you usually don't want the flutes or the piccolos, you usually don't want them down there in that lowest octave. You usually want them in their second or their third octave. That's where they come out the strongest. All right, so, oh, by the way, I should mention, I don't know if our flute player here probably aware, maybe you talk about this in your class in woodwinds, but they do make flutes that have a little adjuster so that you can get actually a wiggle in the seat. Has anyone heard that? Yeah. I don't know too much about that, but I know that the author says it's best not to write any lower than this middle C, because you don't know, for instance, if your players are going to have a flute that actually can produce the B that's lower, the half step lower. So don't even, go down that road, so to speak, and mess around with that. Okay? There is little that the flute cannot do from a technical standpoint, either in legato passages, staccato passages. The book talks about how the flute and the piccolo especially are very agile. They can do a whole lot. The low range on the flute in particular can be effective if, again, as I said, the music, rest of the orchestra is scored lightly, or if their dynamics are low, like in soft passages, the flute in the low range can actually be quite nice. And I'd like to switch to sound, because I want to play a few things for you here that involve flute. Just give me again a minute to connect. Let's see if I'm going to get some sound. This is the flute in the low register. Debussy's famous prelude to the Afternoon of One. Starts out with the flute, solo flute in the low register. You'll notice that at this point there are not many other instruments sounding, and it's very quiet so that the flute in the low register can actually come through. It's a very, I don't want to say classic passage, because it's not classic, but it's a well-known passage. It's a chromatic line for solo flute that's known in the orchestral repertoire. has a velvety, sensuous charm. I can't think of really any better adjectives to describe that. Pretty good. All right, let's listen to another short passage. This one is actually in your book, although I'm not going to show it on the screen because I need to play it to the sound. It's actually on page 78. I'm going to see if I can quickly YouTube Dance of the Reed Flute from the Nutcracker Suite by Tchaikovsky. That is another familiar passage. And the passage actually uses 3 flutes. Let's see. I don't want it to be too loud. You've all heard that before, right? All right. Does anyone have any questions? Again, this is kind of just a quick run through. Does anyone have any questions about the piccolo or the flute? Remember, flute's non-transposing, piccolo sounds an octave higher than Greek. Then let's go next to the oboe. Okay. The oboe, along with the English horn, and the bassoon and the contrabassoon belongs to a branch of the woodwinds known, well, what kind of reed do oboes use? Double reeds. Okay, yeah, they belong to the double reed branch of the woodwind family. You probably know that. The author describes the oboe's tone, believe it or not, he said this, not me, as spicy. Somewhat nasal tone, if you would, for the oboe. It's one of the most distinctive of the orchestral colors. The oboe tone is one that has a way of cutting through other colors and standing out against any background. And if you've heard any kind of oboe music, I'm sure you have, then you kind of know what I mean. Right? I could stand here and try to describe the sound of it until I'm blue in the face, and you probably wouldn't get a good idea until you actually hear it or listen to it to know what it sounds like. So because the oboe's tone can cut through other colors of the orchestra, the oboe is often an ideal solo instrument. Doesn't mean it has to be used as a solo instrument, but it's a good instrument to use as a solo instrument. It's not as agile as the flute or the clarinet, but the oboe can perform with considerable speed and flexibility, either legato or staccato. And because of the tone of the oboe, we probably won't come across this or have experience with this until we start scoring for woodwinds. But what you have to be careful about giving the oboe a secondary or a subordinate line, especially in a passage that's thinly or lightly scored. Right? Let's just pretend you have, a few other woodwind instruments playing. The oboe does not have the melody. The oboe has, let's say, an inner line that's not as important as the melody. What happens, though, if you raise the dynamics for the oboe line a little too much, or if you put it in a high range for the oboe, is it going to be softened underneath the melody? No, not very much. Okay, so you have to be careful when you give the oboe a secondary or a subordinate line. Because of its tone, it can come through too prominently. You either got to use lower dynamics, softer dynamics, or you have to use it in a range where it's not coming out so strong, like not in a super high range. Okay, the next thing I'd like to do for the oboe, the book will say, and I would say this is true of most any instrument, so I don't think it's specific to the oboe, but it'll say that most woodwind, but you could say this of any instrument, If they're in their upper register for too long a time, their tone can become a little bit tiresome. But I think that's true of anything, you know. I mean, everything is, you know, in moderation is kind of a good rule of thumb. If you have something to excess, it can get on somebody's nerves or get annoying or aggravating or irritating after a while. Okay. Next thing I want to do is I want to give you a handout. This comes from a violin concerto by Brahms. But the reason I'm giving you the first few pages of the score is because it starts out with a very nice oboe solo. And this one I want you to be able to see and follow along when I play it. Because I think it's really, really cool. You see the oval line second from the top? I'm trying to highlight it. By the way, most of the way through this handout, usually just the first oboe is playing. You can look at the numbers there, but it's mostly just a single oboe that cuts through the texture. Here we go. That is really good wind writing. It's just really good. Did you hear all the wonderful clarinets and bassoons and everything? It was just exquisite. I can't. It's hard for me to think of a better passage that's just written for wind. So, anyways, I hope that gives you an idea. You guys already know, but gives you a really clear idea in your ears and your mind of the texture and the sound of the oboe and the timbre, that you can use it to its full potential. Incidentally, I remember reading about the oboe that, whereas the flute and the piccolo requires a lot of breath to play, so you gotta have a lot of rest. Well, you gotta have a lot of rest in the oboe line too, but for the opposite reason. I read that with the oboe, it doesn't really take all that much breath to play, so you have the opposite effect of trying to hold in the air and not letting too much come out all at once. And so you have to stagger, well, not stagger breathing, but you have to kind of gauge. so that you have enough air to make. It's hard to describe, but it basically that you don't need a lot of air to make. Is this true? Do you guys play any oboes in the class movements?
I have my secondary in it. And it's not that, it doesn't take as much air, there's a lot of pressure, and so what ends up happening is you often have to, when you have a breath, you actually have to get out of the air, so you'll stop, you'll breathe out, you'll play a little bit more, and you'll breathe in
Okay.
on the next breath. So there's a lot of extreme events, you have to keep that good air going, because otherwise it's just pressure.
Yeah, I mean with the pressure and the balance and everything, this just got to be very intricate, I would think. Okay, thanks. Let's see, anything else on the oboe? Oh no, I guess that's it. So, moving on to the English horn. The tone of the English horn, as you may know, is similar to that of the oboe, but the author describes the English horn's tone as more sonorous and a little bit more melancholy. What does melancholy mean? Yeah. By the way, there's pictures of all these instruments in your book. I figured it's not necessarily to go through those. Possibly because of the serious tone quality of the English horn is seldom called upon to play fast or technically demanding music. It is not a particularly agile instrument either by nature, the English horn. So I don't think I would give it, any 16ths, especially 30-second notes at a allegro or faster tempo. Probably not for the English horn. The English horn, as we know, sounds just like the French horn, sounds a perfect fifth lower than written. And believe it or not, whereas with the flute and the piccolo especially, the bottom register is very weak and thin and breathy. When you get to the bottom register of the English horn, like right around here, and it sounds a perfect fifth lower, the bottom note of the horn is not only usable, but it's actually highly effective down there in its low range. Okay. And when blended with the right combination of other instruments or other timbres, the English horn can actually sound quite serene. I was also going to mention too, the author says the oboe, when the oboe gets down to its lowest register, it gets kind of rough and coarse sounding. So you got to be careful when you're writing, unless you really want something to come out strong. You got to be careful when you're writing the oboe in its low register. But apparently the low register for the English horn turns out to be very, very pleasant, very effective. Okay. All right, the next one I want to show you. I got one more score handout, and this is a pretty, I don't want to say classic passage because it's really from the Romantic area, but it's a very well-known passage for an English horn solo. And I'm sure once you get the music, you'll probably recognize it, even though there's no title. Once again, I tried to highlight the instrument name, Corno Inglese, English horn. Third from the top in this particular score, right underneath the oboe where it belongs. Does anyone know, I know there's, besides that it's the second movement or sole movement from something, does anyone know where this is from? That's right, very good. So we have a 5 or so measures of brass, very nice. And then you see the solo for the English horn comes in at the end of the first page. Oh, we gotta start that from the beginning. flying un sordino with the wood. And now the English horn solo. The clarinet comes in with a harmony line. What's the clarinets? So apparently from YouTube it says that this is a recording by the Chicago Symphony. I don't know exactly what year it was, but I always get a kick out of the conductor of the Chicago Symphony at this time. I get a kick out of his name. This is the conductor's name. Look at the last name. It's classic music. You guys have all had all the skills with me, right? That's his name. Salty. Okay, we're getting towards the end. One thing that I know I don't want to talk at length about clarinets until next class, but one thing I do want to point out to you because of the homework assignment that or worksheet that I'm going to give you is that you need to know this. Most often, the bass clarinet, the notes for the bass clarinet are notated, believe it or not, in the treble clef. You might not know that, but because the notes for the clarinet are notated in treble clef, so are the notes of the bass clarinet. So a clarinetist can read, notes for either instrument. Okay? And when the notes for the bass clarinet are notated in the treble clef, such as this, when the bass clarinetist sees a written C, you need to know that a B flat will come out of the horn. It is a transposing instrument, but not the B flat a second below. For the bass clarinet, the B flat a major ninth below is going to come out of the instrument. So the interval of transposition for the bass clarinet is a major ninth. In other words, it sounds a major ninth lower than written. And therefore, if you're given actual pitches, you need to write those notes a major ninth higher than you want them to sound. Okay? We'll cover that again probably next class. But I think one of the exercises on the handout that I'm going to give you, by the way, the handout is more about transposition. One of the exercises is bass clarinet. So I wanted to point that out to you. The last thing I want to do just before we for the day, just try a few of these. I know you guys are getting to be really good veterans at this, but especially with the English horn, it doesn't hurt to, let's just get rid of this. It doesn't hurt to get a little bit of practice. Okay? So, here I have a written pitch for the English horn. let's say that this is in a major key. I need to know, first of all, what pitch is going to come out of the horn because of its transposition. And I need to know what is the concert key, or the actual sounding key, going to be. Okay. So let's say that this notation written stuff is in D major. If the English horn sounds a perfect fifth lower than written, what is the actual key or concert key the sound is going to come out of? G major, good. One sharp. And what's the pitch that's going to be heard? The G. Good. How about this actual sound? I'm getting an A flat. It looks like it's coming out. We'll say this is a major key as well. It's coming out in the concert key of E flat major. What would I need to write for the English horn in order to get this pitch in this key? Okay, first of all, let's try the key. What would the written key be? B flat major, fifth higher than E flat major, and B flat major's key signature is two flats, right? And what would the written notated pitch be? E flat, that's right. Fifth higher. That makes sense? Does anyone, I think I got through what I needed to get through today. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns? All right. Then let me leave you with, the last thing is I'll leave you with the assignment. This is for, let's see, today's Wednesday, right? This is for Monday. In fact, whoa, is Monday March 1st? I might not see you guys till March. Here we go. Sticking together. Front and back, some transposition exercises. Okay, thank you guys. We'll stop here.